Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's a real privilege to speak with Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Beth is the author of the recently released The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. It's now available through Brazos Press. Dr. Barr is an associate professor of history and associate dean of the graduate school at Baylor University. Her academic specialties include European women, medieval and early modern England, and church history. She's previously served as president of the Texas Medieval Association and the Conference on Faith and History. She's a pastor's wife and mother of two and lives in Waco, Texas. This is a really exciting interview, and Beth and I get into issues of patriarchy, complementarianism, some of the arguments for egalitarianism, and then just the relationships between the sexes within the church and within the culture. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Beth. It's so great to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about your book, Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And can you just give a little backstory? I mean, a lot of your book, you have your personal narrative, but could you just talk about your spiritual journey up to that led you to write this book? Yeah.
So I did not ever intend to write this book. It was really an accidental book. I really never intended to write it. But the book encompasses my life from very early on until where I am now. And it tells the story of how I grew up in a world that considered women's subordinate roles to really be part of the gospel. And now looking back on that, I can see the evolution of that. I can see how I, grew up right when this was starting to be intertwined with the gospel. And that it really came to its, really matured in the early 2000s. And then now I pray that it's starting to unravel. And I'm kind of in that part where it's starting to unravel. And so this book was born in probably desperation on my part. That's really the best way to explain it. And this sort of moment that I had in 2016, where I suddenly realized that all of these things that these churches, complementarianism was growing dramatically in the 2000s. And in my area of the world, in Waco, Texas, we have like over 400 churches in the Waco area. I can count on my hands how many of them are supportive of women in ministry. I mean, it's really pretty horrific. And so it was this moment where I was like, I know all of this stuff. Scholars have deconstructed arguments that support complementarianism. And this is standard stuff, that academics know, that we all know, but nobody in the church knows it.
Yeah.
And so when the opportunity presented itself to me, when somebody came to me and said, have you thought about writing a book? I suddenly kind of like a light bulb went on, and I was like, I'm going to try this. I'm going to kind of give a last ditch effort and see if people will listen. So that's really what the book was born in. I mean, really, it was a moment of desperation. And I'm really pleased how well it seems to be working.
That's really good. And you grew up in the church, right? It's like what was the age where you've like considered that I'm all in, I'm a fully, I surrender my life.
Yes. Yeah. No, I was young. I mean, I grew up, I do not remember not knowing about Jesus.
Oh, that's
do
wonderful.
Not remember not knowing about Jesus. My whole family, it was very, so, it's one of those things I officially surrendered to Christ and was baptized in my early teens. So I was around 13, and so still very young. And I had a lot of maturing to do, but I have never questioned my faith since that time. I even throughout all that I've seen and throughout the whole process of this book and everything that led up to this book, I never questioned God. I knew the problem wasn't God. I knew the problem was people.
Yeah.
And I think part of that was because I have a family that has such deep and strong faith. And also as a medieval scholar, I see the deep faith of Christians before me. And so I was always able to separate the problem with the church from God. And I think that was really helpful to me because my faith never wavered.
What is it that drew you to say when you decided to be a historian? What drew you to the medieval period?
Yeah, that's funny. So I actually started off as a classical, with interest in the classical world. So I'm a classics minor at Baylor, and I was very, very interested in the Greco-Roman world and in ancient history. But as I started thinking about graduate school and in my senior year at Baylor, I realized that when you start, in fact, I was writing a paper on women in the ancient world. And I was like, there are so few sources out here. If I really want to do women's history well in the ancient world, I've got to become an archaeologist, which was appealing. But at the same time, I started thinking about it and I was like, I want to do women and religion. And I'm really interested in Christian history.
Mm-hmm.
And the medieval world just really made a lot more sense because there's so many more sources as compared to the ancient world, but yet it still allows you to dabble in ancient history. And medieval history has always been very attractive to me. So it was a very kind of easy glide and I actually started off as an early medieval historian and gravitated towards the Central and Late Middle Ages. And of course, now I'm a very late medieval historian. So I've kind of run the whole gamut of medieval history from its very beginning to the very end.
Yeah, and when you look at the book that you've written, and I had to read it really fast this week, but I was able to read the whole book. I just got it like 2 days ago, so I was cranking on this, but I absolutely
you were using your academic skills there, yeah.
Well, absolutely. I know. I always tell you, like, yeah, I read your book really fast, but I actually, it's like, that's not an insult, but I did read it. I wanted to make sure I knew it was in there, but and it's done super well because you've done the thing that I know that's not easy just as an academic. It's, it's so easy. We can get rewarded for writing sentences that last an entire page that have, and stuff, but you wrote a book that's accessible. I love the fact that it's kind of got a memoir feel to it because you've woven in your own narrative and you talk about some of the issues that you and your husband faced. And you personally share some painful things about that. So you have this memoir piece, and then you have on top of that, you do some biblical study stuff. You do your historical material. You have some societal reflections. You even talk about Bible translation in this. You put together this wonderful resource, and it's only about 200 pages. Yes. So obviously that opens you up to some criticism because you could have always said more. And the very fact that you've chosen language that's easy to read, means that sometimes you leave some things left unsaid. But what is your sense of? Are you happy with the way the book came out? Is there anything that you would add if you could do it again? I'm just curious how you'd respond to that, even the genre of the book, the way you've ever prepared it.
So I think you captured it really well. A lot of decisions I made in the book were due to writing style and not due to research, which, if this had been an academic monograph, I would have made different choices about some of the things that I discussed. I think most academics understand this. I mean, really, I have received not surprising in the sense that I think anybody is upset with anything I wrote in academia, but surprising in the sense about the people who have reached out to me behind the scenes and be like, this is incredible, how much you covered and the art, what you have done here. And I know that they might disagree with, with some things, not anything really substantial, but like, the Reformation is a minefield of people disagreeing about what's the impact of the Reformation for women. And while everyone would agree that, this emphasis on the godly mother, this arises out of the Reformation in the early modern period, there's a lot of opinions on how this actually impacted, and so I waded into that debate. And I said, what I want y'all to know is that it impacted evangelical women in a very particular way. And this is it, because it gave us only one option. And so I knew that there are going to be some historians that are going to want to put that in broader perspective and are going to want, to consider, and that's perfectly fine. Those are good conversations to have. But even those scholars have all, they have reached out and told me how proud they are of what I have done here. And that, that really helps me to take all of the sort of pushback and criticism that I receive from other areas, because I know that my field is standing with me. Especially a lot of my, feminist historian friends who have been fighting these battles against patriarchy for forever. And they are just so, supportive. And, they'll send me messages like, hang in there, and so it's really great seeing that. However, there are some criticisms, if I think about what I would do differently, there's a couple of things that I probably would do differently. One of them is I did cut a section on race that I really, I tried really hard to incorporate race in this book. It goes hand in hand with patriarchy, but this book was focused on, because of my memoir bit, I was telling a white woman's story in a white woman's church.
Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff with in fact, biblical womanhood, I would actually argue, is a white woman's concept. It was born in white evangelicalism. Now it has moved out in really damaging ways to the Black church, to the global church. I mean, we can study what has happened to it in China, in Korea. I mean, there are all sorts of elements to it. So I kind of wish that I had originally planned on having another chapter that talked about the global reach of this. It just couldn't happen for the size of book that we were going for. Which was really important. So I did have to cut that, and I had to cut some of my stuff on race. I probably still would have made that decision, but I might have had a more full footnote somewhere sort of explaining why I made that decision. But as I said, good books start conversations that lead to more good books. And so what I'm just really hoping, I'm okay if people are like, you didn't do this. I'm like, yeah, you're right, I didn't. I would love for you to do it. There's room, go do this. So I'm okay with that. I wish in my Paul chapter, and actually in the third edition, I changed some language because when you talk about Christianity, I firmly believe that God has always liberated women.
Yes.
I believe that God did this in the Judeo tradition as well as in the Christian tradition. However, when you locate conversations about the liberation of women in Paul, it automatically leads to an assumption that you are condemning Judaism. That's actually not true. It's not what I believe. I think I think the Old Testament is surprisingly liberating for women, which is the Jewish tradition. But I wasn't able to talk about that as much. I didn't get into the Old Testament as much. I mean, really, it was a time decision. So I think maybe I could have been more clear that this is not, that I actually believe Judaism has liberating tendencies. And in fact, if you think about the Paul including women and men in the conversation, like in the household codes, one of the reasons he does that is because Jewish people met together in the synagogue. Women and men met together, in the early, this is actually a Jewish tradition. While we always think about the Jewish, that there's only male priests, but we don't realize that women and men often met together in mixed assemblies. And so, I think some of that paved the way for the liberation of Christian women. I wish I'd maybe highlighted that a little bit more, but that's okay too, because that can expand the conversation and people. So those are a couple of changes that maybe I would have made more. I think the criticism, that fair of people saying you didn't do this, I'm like, yes, you're right, I didn't do that. So, but overall, I'm not terribly upset about it.
No, that's good. And, I was going to actually ask you about the race piece, but so I'm glad you actually just addressed that already. So that's an interesting dynamic. But I think I do agree that a lot of this conversation has ended up being white evangelical Christianity, which is under, for many reasons, a good critique right now in general.
Right.
One of the things I appreciated about the writing style, because I wasn't sure, you see a title, you wonder what it's going to be like to read it. But one of the things that this book isn't about, it's not about a deconstruction at all, in the sense of it's not about you losing your faith.
Right.
And in fact, it's actually a wonderful, I mean, especially the very fact, I mean, you've probably, well, I'm sure you've seen what some folks do with Paul. It's like they just basically assert that Paul is a patriarch, that you can cite all kinds of passages, and so we can just ignore him, and then ends up undercutting biblical authority, which is in my view, at some level, that's oftentimes that seems to be the underlying reason to be a complementarian, is that that's the only way to hold together biblical inerrancy or biblical authority. And you essentially don't even play that game. And so a person who's fully devoted to Christ, loves the scriptures, they read your book and like think, wow, I never saw it like that. But you never attack the Bible or any of these characters or suggest they're not authoritative. So I think that's that was intentional. That shows your own faith, but that's not the easiest line to walk either, is it?
No, I've gotten criticism from that from people who do not think that Christianity is redeemable.
Yeah,
they think that it is so entrenched in patriarchy, and that the Bible itself is, I mean, really, people who approach the Bible primarily as a historical text, and that tells faith of a people, but undercut the divine inspiration of it. They approach the text differently than I do.
Yeah.
And my underlying assumption is that I believe the Bible is written through the hands of people, but I believe it is inspired by God, which is why I think we can find those threads of liberation for people. I mean, I just think it's really remarkable when you look through the Bible. But that is a different perspective from people who no longer see as much of that authoritativeness within the Bible, and also only look, I often say they look at the glass half empty, and patriarchy is entrenched in the Bible. That is very true. But I think it has more to do with people than with God. And so, but I've received a fair amount of criticism from that end of it, but I don't really feel the need to respond to that criticism, because it has nothing to do with the evidence. Right. We actually mostly all agree on the evidence. It has to do with the assumptions behind our premise. And I don't really have any, my assumption is I believe. And so I can't really answer any other way than that. So I just sort of let those people be and just be like, yeah, you're right. If I understand where you're coming from and I understand why you see it that way, I just disagree with you. And I've just left that, because that's about all I can say to them.
Yeah, let's talk about the obvious two key words that we need to think about when we're reading through your book, which is the word patriarchy, and you've used it a couple times, and even complementarianism.
Yeah.
So again, I think we hear these words a lot, but when you use both of those words, what do you mean by patriarchy, and what do you mean by complementarianism?
Yeah, that's great. So patriarchy is the systemic oppression of women. Mm-hmm. It's a structural oppression. It is something, Christians often don't like the term patriarchy. I think part of it is because modern Christians, especially in the US, we are so individualistic, and we don't think about we don't think about structural oppression. We don't like it because our story is that we can always pull up our bootstraps and stand up, and those are the stories we like. We like the stories about the individual who succeeds against all odds. And that's part of the American myth. Yeah. And so when you think about structural oppression, what it says is that there are systemic parts of the world in which we live that keep people from being able to be successful, that limit what they can do. Mm-hmm. And so in Christians, we don't like to hear this, but it's a historical reality that we have systemic patriarchal and racist oppression that exists really from the beginning of civilization. Mm-hmm. And we can trace this out. It's so patriarchy is that women, no matter where they live or what time period they live in, always have less access to resources than men, always have less access to governing positions, power, if you will, than men, and always have less and always are under the authority of male guardians to some extent, almost. And these are pretty consistent themes that we find throughout history. So that's patriarchy. complementarianism is a, same song, different verse. It is a different verse of patriarchy. Patriarchy shapeshifts throughout history. It manifests in different ways. That structural oppression remains. In my book, I tried to explain it like I used Virginia Woolf's phrase, a room of her own, and talked about how sometimes women's rooms are bigger than other times. And the room size changes. And so complementarianism is the modern Christian room that limits women. And so it's a manifestation of patriarchy. And what I think is interesting, complementarian roots patriarchy, not in structure, not in women's childbearing capacity, not in property ownership, which is really the root of most of patriarchy itself. But it roots women's subordination to men in the nature of God. And it says that while God created male and female in the image of God, that women are created with a divinely subordinate role. And in its worst manifestation, this divinely subordinate role mimics the Godhead itself and the role of Jesus. And so that's complementarianism. I recently got nicked for people being upset that I used complementarianism that broadly because they wanted me to define it by their words. And I was like, well, that's what historians do. We look at patterns and we look overarching, and that is complementarianism is this overarching concept. There's many different forms of it, but the root of it is that women are divinely created, that women's divine purpose is to be under male headship. So,
no, that's really helpful. And this is, I'm trying to put a question together because the thing I liked about your book, again, and I'm egalitarian. I think everybody listening to this probably knows I teach at Asbury in the whole piece. Right. Like I really have almost nothing to critique about it. But it's what I found interesting though, because I always say that, like when I talk to somebody on an airplane, say, what do you do? Then I'll say, oh, I'm a professor of biblical studies, which usually nobody wants to talk to me for very long after that. And so what I started to do just for fun is it's like, well, I teach the Bible, and my goal is to make sure that nobody oppresses anybody with anything in the scriptures. That's what I try to say. That's what I do. And I try to use a hermeneutic where I assume that the scriptures always wants me to convert to its message, and at first versus me projecting onto somebody else what the Bible, hey Beth, let me tell you what the Bible means for you. It's like, well, I want to know what it means for me, and I want to change my life, and then I'll share out of that with other people. Right. So and you're, when I read your book, it's almost like, this is that old cliche, but it's like patriarchy as we understand it, and there's I'm sure there's evolutionary reasons that the society's ended up in certain ways, right, and we don't need to go down evolutionary psychology in this interview, but I think that would be an interesting. I need to find somebody to talk about that, I suppose too. But it's like it's kind of like you're almost like we're fish and we're swimming in water and we don't even know we're in the water. And then someday some fish figures out they're in the water, and then it's like, hey, let's go to a different ocean now. So like patriarchy is like the Pacific, and there's an Atlantic, and there's a Caribbean. And it seems ironic. And reading your book was really helpful. And I know a little bit about the book Jesus and John Wayne, though I've just read reviews. I haven't had a chance to look at it. And I know a lot of this stuff, at some level, this whole complementarian position, though obviously it has deep roots, it's kind of a post-World War II response at some level. Is it as simple as U.S. sent 15 million guys to fight a war, and then they had to come back into society, and so we asked women to be housewives so they help these guys get back into culture and recover from the horrors of war and stuff? That's a big piece of this whole thing that we don't always think about, right?
It is a big piece of it. And it is something that we know for sure is a big part of it. We can just look, this is one of those historical patterns that is really interesting. We can look throughout history and we see this often happens in the aftermath of war, when a very, destructive war, we can think about the Roman world. I mean, this is exactly what happens with the family values campaign of the first century. It's not called the family values campaign of Augustus, but I always teach it that way in my class. I used to connect it, and it would connect with students because, I mean, that's what it is. It's a family values campaign. And it was to try to, Rome had suffered and its empire had suffered and they were trying to rebuild. And you need women to rebuild. And so, I mean, in some ways it's reduced down to that. You need women to rebuild a society. And so we often find these types of campaigns that encourage women to produce more children and to be in the home. Although that manifests in different types of ways, what does that mean? But we see this is a pattern, and it happens after World War II. It happens in the aftermath of World War II. And you think about really World War II is just an extension of World War I. So we have this, from 1917 until the 1940s, for the US, 1914 earlier. But anyway, but from really the bulk of the 20th century is this massive war that completely unsettles and shakes up society. And then people are trying to reorder it. I mean, we see this happen in Europe with the aftermath of the Black Death, and society gets completely shaken up and reordered. And then we start seeing these weird laws coming in that try to get people in their place. Like, lower class people can't wear clothes of a certain kind. This is a stupid law. Why do they do this? Because they're trying to reorder society. And we also start seeing laws coming about against women living alone, which we haven't really seen before in the medieval world. I mean, they're trying to reorder society. Yes, this is what the US is doing. We're trying to reorder society. So it is rooted in that. That's not the whole story of what's going on, but that's a big piece of it. And which again is, really the heart of my argument, is that these limitations placed on women are placed on women by our society, not by God.
No, and then the church struggles at different times, whether it's going to subvert that, or in some levels now the church has become, ironically, or certain parts of the church has ironically become defenders of something that was more cultural than it was biblical. And again, the great thing that I think that your job did is that your book did was show the different ways that, in fact, some of the Bible is actually pretty radical. It's almost like that God Must Be Crazy movie where the bottle drops out of the sky and they don't know how to process it. Yeah, I know, it's hilarious, right? But that's what the Bible's like. But then instead, the patriarchy stuff it misses the radical nature of the Bible, because it misses the Coke bottle dropping out of heaven pieces. Instead, it hides the fact that the Bible says radical things for the time, and we almost have to go back and let's live like we're in the Iron Age again in the church. And that's a massive problem when, like person like yourself has a PhD and you can't even teach, you can't teach, I shouldn't laugh because it's a reality, a Sunday school class. And, we hear stories like this all the time.
It is.
I want to be careful for your time. I can talk to you for a long time. I want to ask you like two kind of bigger questions, and then I have some quick ones at the end. So one of the interesting things you talked about patterns. It's one of the things I learned, and when I was reading your book was the interesting piece on sex, and I actually mean sexuality, and with the different sexes or different genders, that like there's a phases where the women are the temptress, the women are the out of control libido folks, and then it shifts in this modern period now. So like if I was 500 years ago, it's not me, it's all the women because they're the temptresses. But now it's me. Now in 2021, I have the out of control libido, and I'm a man. And so it's that I found that fascinating that the perception shifted around that. Can you say something about that and maybe what the implications are?
Yeah, no. So in the medieval world, there was as I said, I've seen some people post out that, my book is arguing that medieval women were freer. And I'm always like, that's not actually what I said. No. But I understand why they walk away. It's all new to them. And they're always positive about it. But I'm like, that's not actually what I said. What I said is that in the medieval world, the reason we limited women was different than the way we limit women today. And in the medieval world, women were connected. It's both out of that Greco-Roman worldview that women, there's something wrong with women's bodies. I mean, this, and it's not just the Greco-Roman world that thinks this too. It's just, this is where my argument started, but that there's something wrong with women's bodies, that women are deformed men. And that they are, and I mean, this is also interesting. I don't want to get into this too much, but in some ways in the medieval world, there was a belief that women's bodies, you know, that there was a continuum. And there's a lot of historical conversation about what this actually means, and all sorts of scholars weigh in this debate. But what we do know is that they did believe that women's bodies could become male bodies. You know, and sort of that, and this is sort of this idea why women can exercise authority if they act more like a man and take on these male characteristics. It can take on the authority of a man, but they have to give up these feminine characteristics, childbirth, mothering, all these things. They have to leave that behind. So it comes with a cost, but it enables them to do this. But the problem is, the reason that they have to become more like men to get closer to God is because women's bodies are flawed. And in the Christian tradition, this is often associated with Eve, that the sin of Eve condemned humanity, and women's bodies are corrupt. They're the temptresses. They're the ones who told Adam those words, you know. I mean, it's kind of, but it's this idea that women are corrupt and at nature, you know, evil. And that men's bodies have a greater capacity to be like God than women's bodies do. So this is still a very flawed understanding. But what we see begin to happen after the Reformation era is where we really have this teaching that women and men are both made equally in the image of God. We have this emphasis really put on women as also being in the image of God, and that women and men can approach God equally. So women's bodies are restored in some sense, broad brush, women's bodies are restored. But then, you know, this is idea with sexuality, you still have to control women's bodies because that controls childbirth, that controls production of heirs, all of this sort of stuff. And so then you have to protect women so that you can keep this, you know, protect them so that you essentially, you know, it's to control women's bodies. And so then we have this idea developed that it is the male body. And part of this also comes with the scientific revolution that emphasizes that men are these aggressors and that they're built to be, you know, more manfully and stronger, and all of this emphasis on how women's bodies are made smaller than men's bodies, which is not always true. But, you know, I mean, you know, I have friends that are male that are significantly smaller than it's just funny how you think about it. But but it comes with this myth that men are more aggressive, and with aggression comes sexual aggression. And you have to protect women who are the weaker sex. It's really funny. The medieval world doesn't use the word weaker sex all that much when it talks about women. I mean, they could, because they often believe that, but it's actually a product of the English Bible translation. And we start seeing weaker sex explode. And it fits with the scientific, you know, revolution about women's bodies. And so women start being identified as the weaker sex, and they have to be protected and sheltered. And 19th century, this comes to fruition with what we call sort of Victorian ideals. And in many ways, the conservative evangelical church is still living in the Victorian world of the 19th century. So that was a quick, may have been more than you wanted, but it was, So that's kind of how we got there.
I always try to think about these because I know the one thing is it's always hard, like that fish in the water kind of analogy. It's always easy to kind of look back and see stuff, but it's always hard to see like what water am I in or what oxygen am I breathing right now. And I think your book, I mean, that's why I love big swaths of history, because you can see that and you can see how things change. And so, you know, at some level, like when you talk about Victorianism, the danger of the church at any point is we have a living tradition, we have a deep faith, we have obviously doctrinal statements and stuff that are rooted, yet we still have to live into a modern period. And so the danger is basically sanctifying some moment, like, and I don't mean any disparaging thing about what I'm about to say, but like I grew up in Ohio, and one of my favorite things about going back to Ohio is the county that's right below. I'm from Akron, Ohio, but the county right below Akron is one of the largest Amish counties in the United States. And so I always love to go down and, see people riding with horses and buggies and delicious food. But basically that tradition, and I'm not going to disparage that at all, but at some level, they just basically froze, the 17th century lifestyle and then continue it on. And you can look at that and you can say, boy, that seems kind of strange. But at the same time, if we're really honest, a lot of what we do is exactly like that. It doesn't look crazy enough that we don't see it yet.
You're exactly right. We freeze. And this is part of this nostalgia, and we always do this nostalgia, like it was better before. It's never better before. It's just different.
Right.
So, no, that's great. That's a perfect way to describe it.
So what do you make of, some of the most staunch defenders of complementarianism sometimes are women. And like you mentioned a couple, I think Tim Keller's wife, and I can't remember some of the other folks, even John Piper's wife, I think wrote some stuff back in the day on maybe I might be wrong about that, but it's like, so what do you make of women that want to defend, say, complementarianism and patriarchy, and they find it personally helpful? I mean, what's the goal of, like, I don't know, we're not criticizing people for if they prefer something, but what do you make of that?
Yeah. So, I know a lot of these women. A lot of them are still my friends.
Yeah.
And I thought about it a lot, and I think about it to me, like, why did I believe this? And I think part of it has to do with identity. We are women from very early ages, and these are really, conditioned. Conditioned's not right. It's not like being brainwashed, but there's an emphasis put on our significance as women, as distinct from men, and that we need to preserve that. And that's what makes us, in a world that really does look down on women, God lifted women up because of what we are, because of what we can, because of our bodies. And so there's a lot of fear that if you let that go, that if you argue that women can do the same jobs as men, that you are minimizing that gender distinctiveness. And so I think it cuts to the heart of women's identities. And I get that. I think it also has to do with the circumstances of many, many women. They have made choices in their lives that have married them to this lifestyle, and they can't really extricate themselves from that. And so should I demand of them to pull the rug out of their entire life over something that's not gospel? No, I'm not going to do that. That's not my point. My point is it's not gospel.
That's good.
And my point is it's not gospel. And most of these women are actually on board with that. They don't think it's gospel either. They think it is a better manifestation of the Bible, but they don't think it's gospel. Some exceptions to that are people like Dorothy Patterson, who I don't know what her game is. I really don't. I'm looking for one of my colleagues at Baylor, Elizabeth Flowers, works on women like Dorothy Patterson, and I hope she figures it out someday. I don't know what her game is. Elizabeth Elliot, I think Elizabeth Elliot, there's been a lot of work on Elizabeth Elliot, and she was a woman who was traumatized early in her life. She was raised on these things. She had a really strange courtship with her to-be husband, with Jim, and it was really strange. And then she's like married to him for like a second.
Yeah, it's true.
And she loses him and has a daughter, and like her whole life anyway. And so much of what she does is almost looking back to a mythical marriage that she never had, but she wants her daughter to like vicariously have this mythical marriage that she never was able to have. So I think a lot of this is a traumatized woman trying to make sense of what happened to her using the vocabulary and what she has been taught. Now, I should not psychoanalyze people. I'm a historian. So, people can, I want to be very sympathetic to her. She had a really hard life. But that's looking at what she's done and reading her stuff. She truly believed this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it has to do with her identity. This is where she put her identity, and it all shattered in a moment. And instead of losing her faith, she rebuilt that identity on sort of this mythical idea of marriage.
Yeah.
I'll stop psychoanalyzing.
That's just really interesting, because my last big question was just really, when you look at your last chapter, you talk about women being set free, and I just wonder what does that look like, and I want to ask it in two different ways.
Yeah.
Because obviously I'm your friendly neighborhood white guy here, grew up in Ohio and the whole thing, and so when I think about these things, and by the way, also I have two biological daughters, 3 stepdaughters. So I'm like a professional father of daughters here. And, like in my own daughters, I have 2 that are going to go, my one daughter wants to be a doctor with medical doctor, and the other one wants to be a clinical psychologist. They're both going for advanced degrees. So it's like, so I see the world that my daughters are going to, and I try to raise them to be, to be everything that God created them to be, essentially.
Right.
And I know that they're going to be in relationships, and they're going to have to figure out how to work all because it's complicated now. It's easy if you just go patriarchy, it's make it easy, but it's more complicated. So what does freedom look like? What would it look like if women were really free in the church? And then also, because I don't see it as a lose for men. What's in it for men if women are freer? So maybe think about it, both of those. Maybe.
Yeah. So I will tell you, when I wrote that final chapter, in our plan that I had presented to Brazos, I was going to write a chapter called Remaking Biblical Womanhood. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I thought, I don't want to say that anymore, because I think biblical womanhood this is not a concept I want to support in any sort of way. Because I don't think we see God calling us to do certain things because of our sex. I think we see God using people where they are to do his work, to spread the gospel. And gender matters, but it doesn't matter as much as I think it does. I think what matters more is that we believe in Jesus and we are Christians. So I got to the end, and I didn't really, and so I kind of just had this, I wrote most of that chapter in one sitting, really, truly. I pulled on some of the research that I had intentionally meant to put into the rethinking, remaking chapter. And, I have a whole series of questions I ask at the end. And really that was me. It's just saying, what if we did this?
Yeah.
What if we did this? And I didn't leave answers because I don't know what yet it'll look like. But I just wanted people to think. It's like, really, what if we did this? And I've been really surprised by the outcome of that chapter. Women have really taken, and men too, have taken to that chapter. And I get messages all the time just saying, oh my gosh, you've given the gospel back to me. I was so, people all the time, they felt so weighted down by all these expectations that people told them they had to do, even men. I think about my poor husband. He was carrying these heavy burdens about what people told him he was supposed to be a godly man.
Yeah. And
he carried as many burdens as I carried. And what I think, by decentering what it means to be a godly man or a godly woman, and recentering what does it mean for me to be faithful to what God has asked me to do, frees us.
Yes.
Because it's no longer about what other people think of us, it's about what God has called us to do. And we just do that work. And I know that's overly simplified. I know there's all sorts of things that come in, but it also frees us because, there are so many men who are not natural born leaders. They are much better. Their families would do much better with their wives leading Bible studies if they all want to sit down. And I very rarely have found a family where those types of Bible studies all together really work well.
Right.
I don't know. They didn't work in my family growing up. They don't really work in, we're a pastor's family's household, but I found that individual conversations with our kids and encouraging them and connecting them with other adults who encourage them and talk with them about their faith is much more important than us trying to sit down as a family and do sort of these, forced devotionals or something. That usually just creates kids that are bored, and I don't know. So it seems to me that we keep trying to force both women and men into roles that they don't fit in. And that causes stress, and that causes us to that causes frustration, that causes when we fail, that causes us to feel like failures all the time. That's what Mark Driscoll was doing to his flock. It was a church of shaming people to be something other than what God had called them to be.
As soon as you give, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. It's destructive.
Yeah. So no, yeah. As soon as you start, and folks should listen to that whole CT podcast on Mars Hill. It's just so fascinating. It's out right now. And I'll just stick that in the notes since we mentioned that, because it's just really fascinating. But it's obviously like all those systems, you're that specific on stuff. It may work for somebody, but it's not going to work for everybody, and certain kinds of men, certain kind of women. I thought it was funny. I don't know if you did this on purpose, just based on your answer. I noticed, and again, I had to read your book fast, but I noticed, I think at least several times you talked about mowing the grass. I think that was in your book. And that made me laugh, but that's what you're talking about in a sense. Cause it's like, I've nothing, I'd be happy. Well, I live in a townhouse, so I don't have to mow ever again. I just have somebody else does it for me. But, I used to mow the grass, and I would think, geez, I wish my wife would mow the grass. That's awesome. But that's kind of a play on traditional gender roles. I don't know if you did that on purpose, or was that on purpose that you put that in there? Or is that just true? I know it's true, but that was just kind of fun, that kind of a subtle signal about whoever's best at something, just do that. And is that kind of what the whole point of that illustration was, or was it just?
It was both and. It was true. It was the moment that we had that conversation, but it is also something that has been true about our marriage. My husband and I are both very strong individualists, and we both, there are some, my motto in my marriage is, if I can do something, why am I asking my husband to do it?
That's good.
So I'm a good cook. My husband's a terrible cook. He's gotten a little bit better, but he's not good at it. I hate doing dishes. He does things like that well. He does all our laundry because he's really good at it. He folds. I never used to fold my laundry, and he folds it beautifully. He does a lot of traditional, I guess, what you would consider traditional masculine things too, but he doesn't do them because he thinks he's supposed to. He does them because he does them.
Yes.
And that's sort of the same with me. I like mowing the lawn because it gives me an immediate gratification.
Yes.
Those nice, neat rows. It was also a way to sort of accomplish outdoor activity with something that was useful, because I'm just one of those people where I'm always like, well, this isn't useful. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm like, my grandmother was like that. I'm kind of like her, where I only want to do useful things. And mowing the lawn combines exercise and immediate gratification.
That's true.
So I like it. My husband hates it. So I just always did that task.
Well, I just love that being in the book. 'Cause to me, if I was going to answer your own question, and it's oversimplistic, but I just always think Paul has that wonderful body language where it's basically about unique talents. And if we can get everybody on the planet, and let's assume they're all Christians, but if everybody on the planet just simply did the thing that they were really good at most of the time, we'd have an awesome world to live in. And we ought to just model that in the church, and not just limit people by their biology, basically.
No, that's it. We have people in the church doing jobs that they are not called to do.
Right.
And it causes problems. And it causes frustration. It causes burnout. We get burned out the least when we are doing what we are gifted to do.
Yeah, I just fundamentally agree with that. And I love that. And again, I want to thank you for the book. Could you let me ask you two really fast questions. These are the ones I like to ask all my guests. Actually it's three, but the third one's really easy. Like the first one is like, you've been under, just right in the book. I follow your Twitter account. I told you, I know you've taken some criticism, but so like, how do you, what are your rhythms? And you don't have to be super specific, but like, what keeps you grounded, and how do you feel yourself? You're here smiling, and I've read some of the things that people have said, and you're sort of laughing and smiling. So like, what I know it's your faith, but like, what do you do from a spiritual formation perspective to be able for you to be as, as kind as you're able to be able to hold space and, do your work, be a wonderful mother, be a great wife, be a great professor. And, so what fuels you? What do your rhythms look like?
I think part of it is that my faith is very strong. I'm also surrounded by people who support what I'm doing and who are, I have friends who contact me sort of regularly, and I'm naturally an optimistic person. So, I'll kind of go down where I'll be like, everything's falling apart.
Right.
And then my husband comes home and is like, well, you knew it would happen. It's okay. We'll just get, it's fine. And so I get back up and I'm like, okay, it's fine. So I kind of am naturally like that anyway, I think, which has probably helped with this whole thing. But this is not my life.
Yeah, that's good.
I am a professor, a dean. I live with undergraduates. We're faculty and residents, so I don't actually have to mow the lawn anymore. But that's my life.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So this is not all that I do.
That's so good.
And I think that helps a lot. Another thing is I know what my mission is. I know why I wrote this book. I did not write this book for fame. I did not write this book to get attention. I did not write this book to make money. I mean, as academics, I don't think we ever try to write books to make money because it just doesn't occur to us that you can actually make money from books.
That's right. You usually get a hamburger or something with your royalty check,
exactly
right?
We joke about it. We're like, oh, we can go out to dinner tonight with, my royalty check for the past 3 years. So, that helps me too, because I know why I wrote this book. I wrote this book to help women.
It's so good.
And I think it's working.
Yeah.
And so that always helps me bounce back, I think. And as I said, and then also my faith is just really, I teach Sunday school every week. We're going through the book of Acts. I love that. It's so fun. That keeps me, because I see what God does through people. And I'm excited that, God can change people and God works through people. And that's amazing to me. And that keeps me going.
Good. And besides the scriptures, what are again, this is the impossible question, especially if somebody like yourself who's read a million books, but like, if you're going to pick 2 or 3 books that really help to shape you spiritually, so not even necessarily academically, but spiritually, other than the Bible, what were a couple books that have been really influential in your life, would you say?
No, that's easy. Dorothy L Sayers. Dorothy L Sayers, huge influence on my life. I've been reading her since I was a teenager.
Yeah,
and some things have become more significant over time from her, but I love her essays. She has beautiful essays that she has written, and her plays. And she was a magnificent playwright. And then, of course, also her mystery series. That's where I got into Dorothy L Sayers, was with her mysteries. And Gaudy Night is a deep, deep book that deals with the heart of what I was doing in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. It's about, what is your job? What is your job? That is the heart of Gaudy Night. What is a woman's job? And essentially what Dorothy L Sayers, she has several moments throughout this. And part of it too is like, what do you do with women who are born with both hearts and brain? And what are you called to do? And her answer is, you do what God calls you to do. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really matter what people say you should do. You do what God calls you to do. And that's it. That's my working sort of idea. I mean, it very much was shaped, I think, a lot by, that Dorothy L Sayers' writings have come more and more up in the forefront as I realize how they have shaped me. And I realize how much I agree with a lot of what she's written. So I would say that she is like a number one person who really has influenced me. She was also a medieval scholar, which cool. I love, because medieval sources appear in her text. And I'm like, I was there. I read that source, I know what you're talking about. And so I love that too about her. But along with that, some of the other perhaps writings that have deeply, I am, as much as I think the 19th century damaged our modern world quite a bit, I actually love 19th century writing. I love it. And so I am a huge, like, Elizabeth Gaskell. fan. And I love, in fact, some of my comfort books are North and South. And I love North and South because it shows how different, I love North and South because it shows how culture shapes people and how what we think is, innately, even in a small place like England, a tiny place.
Yeah.
And people living on opposite ends of England are vastly different, not because of anything nature, but because of the cultures that have shaped them.
Yeah, it's good.
And they can learn to overcome those. I mean, I love that about North and South. And the 19th century was grappling with a lot of these questions, and like nature versus nurture. I mean, that was a big one in the wake of Darwinianism and et cetera. So you see this in some of their texts. I also love Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins makes me laugh hysterically. So I read a lot of Wilkie Collins. So anyway, so that I could go on and on. I'm a book person.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Person. No, so thank you.
Those are some.
And if people want to interact with you, is there a great place online that you like people to go to if they want to check out your stuff?
Well, I'm most common. You can find me on Twitter.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, you can find me on Twitter. I try to keep a good spirit on Twitter. I mostly am successful. I'm not always successful, but I quickly bounce back when I'm not successful. So, it's been a struggle. Living life in the open on social media is hard. Yeah. And I found the best way to do it is just to be yourself and not worry about what other people say. And recently, I used to just mute people, and I have finally started blocking people. I'm just like, whatever, I'm not going to put up with, and so I've started blocking people lately, and it makes life a lot better.
No, it's good. I mean, that's
yeah. So Twitter is easy. I'm always Beth Allison Barr. So you can find me Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as website. But the place that I am most often present is Twitter.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, I want to thank you for your generous time here. I didn't mean to take as much of your time, but this has been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Beth. And I want to thank you again. I know it's not easy writing a book, and it was like this book, you almost called to write the book out of your circumstances. Right. And I just think that you've done a great job. I'm just grateful for the witness that you're doing. And I'm super grateful that you put a book together that's really constructive and not really destructive or deconstructive. So I just appreciate that. And it's been wonderful to meet you today.
Yes, it's been nice to meet you. I would tell you that I'm going to be at Asbury, but you're in Florida, but I'm actually coming to speak at Chapel. In January.
Well, there's some folks that are probably up in Wilmore close to it that are listening, so they'll check that out. That'll be so that'll be awesome for you to go up there, and we can watch it on live stream. So I'll probably be able to check that out. And friends, everybody who's listening right now, thank you for listening all the way to the end of this episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'll have everything in the show notes. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope in the world that needs it. Amen. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you share it with friends or others in your network? And would you consider leaving a review to help other people find this episode? All of the resources are in the show notes, so I invite you to check those out. And I want to also say, if you're interested in learning about centering prayer, my book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, will be released in September of 2021. You can get it already on Amazon. And if you would like information about centering prayer and some help getting started, you can also sign up for information directly with me. Go to centeringprayerbook.com. All that information is also in the show notes. I will see you next time.